We are hopeless, selfish creatures, and we need a savior.
She was a total heathen.
All right, we're doing a podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of an ExMo and an Evermo Walk into a Bar. Again, today we have René Steelman stepping in for Kate. Thank you so much for being here again. I always love when you co-host. You have such a great, strong voice, and I just love hearing all of your perspectives. So.
Well, and I having this girl thing is thrilling me. You don't even understand how thrilled I am to have something that doesn't involve sausages. It's just we need more non-sausage podcasts.
Absolutely. I agree. And I love this space. I love being able to chat with women, and especially in an ex-Mormon, never Mormon space when the faith is so male centric and lifting up of men. So I love being able to hear women's voices, especially from women who've been silenced for a lot of their lives. So and with that, I will introduce Megan Connor. She is back again. Yay. She is amazing. And I love your strength and your story and your storytelling. And I am so excited to have you back. She talked about her story last time and being trafficked as a young child, and then her resilience and coming out of that, this strong, incredible woman using her voice for others and to uplift others. And today, what are you going to talk about today, Megan?
Well, I think last time we left on a little bit of a cliffhanger, because when I finished my story, right when I was finishing up my healing from all of my childhood trauma, was when my crazy cousin Lori Vallow started getting involved in everything that she was doing around that time period. It was, I finished my outpatient treatment, my intensive outpatient in the summer of 2019. And her husband, Charles Vallow, was killed July 11th of 2019. So it was all happening right around the same time. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
That, that must have been bananas. I cannot even imagine. And I watched one of the documentaries recently, the one that's on Netflix. I need to watch the other one that you recommended to me, and you can recommend it to the audience too, because I know you're in that one and I would love to see it. Where and what is the other documentary about this?
So I will say there are a ton of documentaries, but the one that I was in was for the CW network. They have a series called, of course, it just left my brain.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think it's called Crime Nation. Yes. Okay. So their series on the CW is called Crime Nation, and the episode that I was on was called Fatal Devotion, and it was all about
title.
Yeah, it was all about Lori's case. And they actually brought me on after they had already wrapped production for everything. They had interviewed my cousin Adam, who's Lori's brother. They had interviewed Dr. John Matthias and my friend Lauren Matthias from Hidden True Crime. And one of the producers was asking Lauren, is there someone we can call to get some family pictures? And Lauren said she had recommended that they call me long time ago, and they never did. No big deal, whatever. But she said, yeah, didn't you guys call Megan? She's got all these family pictures. And they're like, oh yeah, we should call her. So I remember they called me, it was in December. I was visiting my sister for Christmas time, and I got on the phone with this producer and just told a little bit of my part of the story, but also a little bit from the ex-Mormon perspective, because nobody else in the family certainly was talking about the role of the church's core doctrine on Lori and Chad's beliefs.
Right.
And so I gave them some background and history on that, how the importance of the temple in Mormon culture. And the guy who was just in charge of getting pictures. He wasn't in charge of anything else, but he was a producer. And he said, after talking to you, I really want to have you on this documentary because you're giving this perspective that we haven't heard before. So he contacted his producer. We talked maybe just a couple of days after Christmas for about 2 hours on the phone. Her name is Vicky Song. Absolutely love her. She's wonderful. And she said, yeah, we need to have you come out to New York. We need to have you come and tell your story for the documentary. So they flew me out there, and it was just a whirlwind couple of days trip. But I went and talked for probably about 4 hours about the case, and it was actually really cathartic for me to do that because I got to
Yeah.
say a lot of things that I hadn't really talked about in public before, and they got a unique perspective for the documentary. So it turned out really well.
You know,
I I
I'm
love
sorry.
that.
I'm sorry,
No, go
Erica. You mentioned something, and I thought it was interesting, the timing, because right now the church has released. The church hasn't. A gentleman, Robert. I can't remember what Robert's last name is, but in Inconvenient Faith, they've just
Mhm.
released this document. I don't know if it's a
Documentary,
documentary or a
docu-series, or
docuseries. Yeah, docuseries, like 9 episodes on YouTube called Inconvenient Faith. And so people are doing feedback podcasts on it. And the other day I heard someone say, one of the feedbacks that they don't talk about, and most people are being very, very fair and very positive about it. But one of the things they brought up was that what Fair and Faith Matters and the Restore Conference and the apologetics will say that the general authorities say in private, at a private lunch, at a private gathering, is nothing like what they say over the pulpit. And someone brought up, until they over the pulpit on television say, we disavow visions of glory, we disavow the actions of these people, or we disavow the idea that because Nephi killed Laban, that's a reference to being able that one man shall fall so that nations don't fall. They have to disavow these crazies, because there's a statistic out there, and I can't remember the wonderful journalist that brought this up, but she said, even though statistically the number of really radical Muslims is only, say, 20%, and this is millions and millions of people, it's only 20%. Those 20% are doing 100% of the crazy. And so, you cannot disavow these crazies, Ruby and Jody and Lori and Chad, these and all of the brothers, that did all of the killing. You cannot disavow those and not address them. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that is the problem with these radical. Yeah, no, of course, not every Mormon is going around killing their children, obviously. We want to sometimes, but no. But but of course there's crazies, but they are
yeah.
based on doctrine that's taught. And
Mhm.
I'm glad you brought that up, because it does bring it more into a current perspective of what's going on. So,
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And I definitely want to dive super into the like sort of where the Mormon overlaps with this case, because you could sort of argue it in any which way, obviously, that from whatever your perspective is. But before we go deep into the rabbit hole, just in case there is anybody who doesn't know what happened here, can you just do sort of a brief synopsis in terms of what went down a few years ago?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll try to keep it as brief as I possibly can, but while including the details that I think are important for people to know. So Lori and I grew up together. We were cousins. We are cousins, but we spent a lot of time together as children and young adults. And then I also lived with Lori and Adam for a little while they lived in Austin. And Lori was a bridesmaid at my wedding. So we grew up very close. Family was really important to it's important in Mormonism, um, obviously, but especially in my family, it was important to my parents that we know our cousins and spend time with our cousins on both sides of the family. So my dad is Janice Cox's younger brother. Janice is Lori's mom. And so that's how I'm connected to that part of the family. And so, Lori and I actually had really similar trajectories growing up. I think I shared that I got pregnant as a 19-year-old mainly because I was programmed to believe you could never say no to a man. Especially if whatever it was that they wanted, you just let them take what they want. That's how I was programmed, not just from Mormonism, but also from my abuse as a child. And so, I ended up pregnant. My oldest daughter was born the week before my 20th birthday. And then I got engaged a couple of months later. This person had been with me through most of the pregnancy and, was super great about it. And we got married the following May. Well, that was after Lori had already been married twice. When she left high school, she ran off with her high school sweetheart. They were only together a couple of months, if I remember correctly. There was some drug use involved, and the family story was that Barry and Adam, I believe, had gone to rescue Lori out of this situation and drag her back home.
Ah.
And so that's how that happened. And then, no, sorry, she hadn't been married twice. My apologies. She had only been married once to Nelson at this point when I got married. And then shortly after that, I believe, is when she got involved with William LaJoya, who is Colby's biological father. And his family lived in Del Rio. So Lori would be back and forth from Del Rio to San Antonio, bringing her oldest son, Colby. And so Colby is not that much younger than my oldest daughter. And so since Lori and I were close, they were close as well for the first few years. Like we would take them to the Target photo studio and get pictures taken of them as kids, like as if they were
siblings.
siblings. Yeah, exactly. But that only lasted a few years because then Lori went on to marry Joseph Ryan. And when she married him, she moved to Austin. They had a lot more money. She then had Tylee. And Tylee was only probably 2 or 3 years old when I visited Lori at their home for the last time. She would always do my hair. I would always travel to wherever to get my hair done. And I remember shortly after that visit, Lori was spouting all these accusations about Joe Ryan assaulting her kids. And I didn't really know how to deal with that. I hadn't dealt with any of my own SA at that time. And I frankly didn't know who to believe anymore because Lori was always telling the narrative that was the most painted her in a great light and painted
Yeah.
everybody else in this light like they were a monster.
Yeah.
And I had been on the receiving end of some of that when we lived together in Austin. And so I didn't really know what to believe. I just knew that there was this huge cognitive dissonance around all of it. And I backed away from her and from that part of the family at that time. And that was around 2004 or so. Not to mention the fact that I also just started graduate school at that time. And so it just was a very busy time in my life and a confusing time in hers. And so I just didn't really talk with her much after that. But the Coxes lived in San Antonio during this entire time period. And I was still very much involved with her parents and, them being in San Antonio for the next couple of years. And then they moved away as well. So I sort of lost touch with them and that part of the family at that time, but I still kept in touch with Summer, especially on social media. Melanie Boudreau, who was Stacy's daughter, Lori's niece. I kept track of all of them via social media. Lori, funnily enough, did not really do social media, which I found interesting for someone who is so absorbed with their self-image, their public image. But anyway, I remember hearing rumblings around the 2015-ish time period that whole part of the family was getting really interested in near-death experience books. And I was too at that time. I'm not sure exactly what it was that prompted it, but I was reading those books as well. And I was teaching gospel doctrine. And one day after a lesson about the second coming, a woman in my ward approached me, and I can't remember for the life of me who it was, but she brought me this manila envelope and she said, "You're going to want to read this book. This is an excellent book about the end times. I can't wait to hear what you think about it." And I got home and opened it up, and it was Visions of Glory. And so I read it as a faithful LDS member,
Yeah.
and I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Because I was like, here's this book that's written sort of anonymously. So the guy obviously doesn't want publicity. He's not trying to gain recognition or money. He just wants to tell his story. And it's a story that affirms everything that we believe, that there's going to be a lot of destruction around the end times, that there are dreams and visions. There's going to be a gathering that takes place. Like, it reaffirmed all this stuff. So I thought, this is a great book. I shared it with my sister. I was so excited to tell her about it. She read it and she was like, I don't think this is really that great of a book. I think this is an apostate book. And I was like, what? Really? And she said, yeah, just based on the fact that at the end of the book, this guy's office is right next to Jesus's office in this office building. And that Jesus comes to him to give him instructions about what he's supposed to be doing. And he sort of is like really putting himself on a pedestal here. And I was like, oh, shoot, you're right. He really is trying to make it to be like he's just as good as Jesus, and that's bad. So
And the fact that Jesus even has an office.
I know,
He's doing his
ridiculous.
Jesus work.
I also just have to say, for those people out there who are curious about the book, please don't buy it. It's available in used bookstores and whatever. It's also available as a PDF online. If you're really curious about it, go listen to the Mormon Stories episode where me, Lauren Matthias, Mindy Caldwell, John Dehlin, we do an 8-hour deep dive on the book. There's nothing you won't discover from watching that episode that you could by buying them. So please don't buy the book. But anyway, I just on the note, Erica, that you're saying like he has an office, there's this other ridiculous part where there's like a general conference and everybody, gets tickets based on their level of, I don't know, righteousness or something. And in this conference, they go into the conference center and there's like all of these prophets from the past dispensations have come back to life. And Joseph Smith is sitting there. And right next to Joseph Smith is this really unassuming kind of guy. And he's wearing like a J.C. Penney suit and a red tie. And it turns out that that's Jesus.
Oh, I thought you were going to say it was Donald Trump. I was like, oh, wow, already
Same thing, right?
Prophesied. Yeah. Okay.
So Joseph Smith gets up to speak, and basically just kind of gets really humbled and has to like bow his head and introduce everybody to the Savior. And he's standing there wearing a J.C. Penney suit. Anyway, I found that to be hilarious.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so we were all reading these near-death experience books. And then a couple years later, well, during this time too, my cousin Braxton, who's from another part of the same family, he was doing all this extreme doomsday prepper stuff, and he was on all these documentaries and all this stuff. So it was a big part of the family discussion. And then a couple years later, I found out that Lori had sort of gotten, reignited into being religious. Up to this point, she was a cafeteria Mormon, like a lot of us are, picking and choosing what was important to her. And I remember her even making a comment to me at one point saying that, like, we don't even really need these full length garments. All we need is like a little bra and panty set that just has the markings in it. We'll just be fine. So she always had her own ideas about how to live the gospel on her
She
own
was
terms.
nuanced. She was progressive.
She
could have been at the Restore conference with the other apologetics.
Right. Very nuanced. So around that time is when she started attending these prepper conferences that were affiliated with the church in Arizona and Utah. She even dragged her family. I believe Aunt Janice and Uncle Barry and even Summer went to one of these conferences with her. And then she started attending the temple every single day. And I remember seeing this Instagram post with my Aunt Janice and Lori, rare instance to see her on social media. And Janice was commenting on how much she loved her temple going girl and that she was attending daily. And I found that to be very, very odd because that was not in line with the Lori that I grew up with or knew when, we were both living in Austin, being young teenagers, partying and all that stuff. So I was surprised by that. And then apparently around, a little while after that is when she met Chad Daybell at one of these conferences. But I really believe that they were talking online long before they met in person for a couple of reasons. One is because Christopher Perrett, who runs the Avow website, it's a voice of warning. It's a prepper website. Really, it's a warmongering website. They're trying to incite civil war, if you ask me. But he put Chad Daybell and Julie Rose content behind a paywall. So you could pay extra to chat with Chad and Julie. And I believe that Lori was doing that for a long time because the conference where they met in person for the first time was in October of 2018. And Chad actually bought his first burner phone a few weeks before that conference happened. And so I really believe that they had already been talking and plotting and planning on getting together. And then they saw each other in person at this conference and sort of, solidified their relationship at that point. And so there was another friend of theirs whose name was Jason Mao. Jason did these podcasts as well, had Lori on his podcast. And he liked to dress up as Moroni. He liked to cosplay Moroni. His podcast was called the Warrior Up Podcast. And I believe that while this conference went on, that Chad and Lori met Jason Mao in the temple, along with Julie Rowe, possibly, I think, who was her other friend, Melanie Gibb. introduced Lori to Melanie Gibb at that time as well. So Jason was kind of the connector who brought all these people together, in my opinion. And Lori made reference at one point that she was married to Moroni in a past life or whatever. And so I don't know if that was a literal reference or if, Jason Mao posing as, she said that Moroni married her and Chad in the temple with Jesus Christ as a witness. And so I think that happened in that October timeframe as well. And then Lori, after this conference was over, of course, she and Chad were in direct communication all the time. And Lori was doing all these podcasts. And then January of 2019, she and Charles had already kind of been having marital problems. And Lori just decided to disappear. So at this time, Colby was already an adult living on his own. And JJ and Tylee were living with Lori and Charles at this time. And they had talked about divorce before. They had been having, problems or whatever, but they had always kind of reconciled. Well, Lori just disappeared during this January timeframe. And from what I understand piecing together, and I've forgotten some of the facts about the case, so forgive me if I go a little astray, but I believe that what happened is that Lori took Tylee and they went to Hawaii at this time. So Lori abandoned JJ and left him with Charles. And when they got back from Hawaii, Lori just kind of said, she didn't really contact Charles. I think at this time she left Tylee living with Alex, and she was doing who knows what, still going to the prepper conferences, I believe probably meeting with Chad Daybell, doing all this stuff. And then when she got back from that was when Charles said that he wanted to reconcile. If I remember correctly, this part is really fuzzy for me because I wasn't in touch with anybody at that point. But essentially she disappeared for a really long time. They didn't know where she was, and she had kind of abandoned JJ. And that was when Charles basically said, I think we should go ahead and get divorced, and, wanted to know if Lori was going to move to Houston. And she said no, she preferred to be in Arizona. So Charles rented a house for her in Arizona where she could stay with Tylee and JJ. And then Charles would come back and forth from Houston to visit for custody purposes. So during this entire time, once Lori returned, it was sometime in late February, I believe. Actually, it was probably had to be March-ish timeframe, because I remember what happened was that Charles's mother had passed away, and Lori did not go with him. No, that was the prior year. I apologize. That was 2018. So anyway, 2019, they decide to get divorced. And at this time, Lori is basically telling everybody in her immediate family that Charles had been having an affair, and that, he was treating her badly and arguing with Tylee, basically getting to alienate the family, to alienate Charles, and to isolate him. So nobody in the family would talk to Charles except for Adam. And Charles was sending these emails, also Brandon Boudreaux, but that's another rabbit hole. So Charles was emailing everybody in the family saying, Lori keeps saying that she is some kind of an exalted being. She keeps saying that I'm not Charles. She keeps calling me Ned. And she basically is saying that she's going to murder me with her powers, and that she can have an angel dispose of my body. So Charles is desperately trying to get help for Lori because he believes that she's lost her mind. And nobody in the family will listen to him except for Adam. So Charles and Adam talk, and they finally agree that maybe the best way to have this all stop is if they have an intervention with Lori where they get her temple recommend taken away. Like maybe that will snap her out of this, where she realizes, okay, this is not Mormon doctrine if I'm being excommunicated or getting this temple recommend taken away because of what I'm saying. So they're hoping that that's what's going to happen. So Charles arranges for Adam to come down to Phoenix. They're trying to get the state president looped in to do this sort of intervention. And the family finds out about it because Adam tells Alex, hey, I'm coming into town. Can I stay with you? Alex originally says, sure, you can stay with me. But then when Adam lands, Alex doesn't answer. So Adam ends up going to stay with his mom, which is incidentally where Adam's son is also staying, at the Cox's house. And so now we have all these text messages and evidence where Janice and Summer were reporting back to Lori about what Adam and Zach were doing that whole day and trying to keep them away from Lori and Alex. So the night before Charles is supposed to fly into town to pick up JJ for a custody visit, Alex decides to go spend the night at Lori's house, and he brings a gun with him. Now, Alex had no reason to stay at Lori's house. He didn't live that far away. Um, Summer had offered to stay with her. She was really worried about Charles, hurting her in some way. She had pulled up this narrative of like, I'm
Yeah.
worried that Charles is going to cause an argument. He's going to hurt Tylee. So she pretends to be concerned. And, finally, Alex says, well, I'll stay with her, brings his gun with him. And from what I can tell from the way the crime scene photos came out and everything, it looked like Tylee and JJ were staying together in a room, and Alex had his own room for this overnight stay. So Charles shows up the next morning to pick up JJ, and he's texting back and forth with Adam, and he says, Alex's truck is here. And Adam says, they must be planning something. And Charles says, absolutely. And to me, that means like, whatever it is they're planning, it's whatever. He knows that he's bigger and stronger than Alex. And he's like, whatever. He can try to come at me with a taser, just like he did to Joe Ryan, but that's not going to happen. So he goes into the house. And I believe that what happened is that, they got the kids outside, that JJ was already outside in the car. And I think that Alex ambushed Charles and shot him. And so then Lori leaves with the kids. She goes through the Burger King drive-through to get breakfast for JJ, drops JJ off at school, drives around for another 40 minutes or whatever, all talking to Alex this whole time. Alex waits 48 minutes before calling 911. And then he finally does call 911. The police arrive. He comes out claiming that he shot Charles in self-defense, claims that there was a baseball bat involved, which I think is dubious. I don't think the bat was ever around, during this incident. And they go down to the police station, they do their interviews, and Lori leaves with a victim's advocate. They believe the story initially of the self-defense issue.
Which is a little bit wild, and I don't know, I only know sort of peripherally and in what I've seen in the documentary, but the footage of her in this moment is wild because she's like alerted that her husband or ex-husband or soon to be ex-husband has been killed, and she's very nonchalant, which you can respond in any way, but she does not seem even surprised, just like, oh, okay, yeah. And like, I mean, it's like from a perspective, hindsight is 2020, but like her response in that moment was bananas, even given all the different ways that someone could respond. It was like she already knew. That was the weirdest
Right.
thing. Like, yeah, okay, that's fine, whatever, I know that. Which was the weirdest thing, is that it seemed so expected. So yeah, it was just interesting to me. Her response was one of total nonchalance and no surprise at all whatsoever.
Right.
Well, and you
Right.
know what's interesting? There's been a lot of stuff in the Gilbert Chandler area of Arizona, and there's a lawyer, a family lawyer there. I forget what her moniker is, but she's reporting more on the teenage stuff that's going on. And the Gilbert police and the Chandler police are just, I mean, they could be in a 1940s cartoon. I mean, they are the Keystone Cops.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
amazing how unprofessional and doofuses they are in
Right.
so many areas. So yeah, probably the worst thing is watching that interview that Charles has with the cops, and they're like,
Right.
whatever, you're a big, strong guy. I don't think that little girl's going to hurt you. It's,
Right. And he even says, she's been threatening me. And one of the officers says, well, what did she say? And he said, Charles says, she said she's going to destroy me. And the officer says, well, that's not a threat. And then he does go on to say, she did say that she was going to murder me with her powers, destroy, make
Yeah.
off with my body, whatever. And they're probably thinking to themselves, well, this lady's just crazy. So Charles did try to have her involuntarily committed. And she
Yeah.
actually submitted herself to that evaluation and passed with flying colors, is the way that she described it. So it's absolutely, it doesn't surprise me at all to hear that Lori went in for an evaluation and she probably told them, he's crazy. He's just mad because I caught him having an affair. She gets pretty privileged. She blinks her eyelids. She says, this is what's going on. It's a contentious divorce. Of course, he's going to say I'm crazy. I never said any of those things. And she just gets a pass.
Yeah.
And then to your point, Erica, after she does this trip of taking JJ to school and stopping to buy flip-flops on the way, by the way, she comes back to the crime scene when they're already interviewing Alex. He's sitting there on the curb as the shooter. And she is very, that's how everybody has described her, is very nonchalant and just
Hi,
unfazed.
neighbors. Yeah.
And you're right, she did know already. And, that sort of came out in the trial of, in one of the trials of, she'd been on the phone with Alex. So she already knew he'd been shot. She even said in her police interview that she heard the shot. So she was not surprised that he'd been shot. But even when Detective Inclan did the death notification, she was unfazed. Now, if you want to give her the benefit of the doubt, which I don't know why you would want to, but just to say all sides here, if you're in a contentious divorce with your ex and you're afraid for your safety, and it turns out that they do get killed somehow, I can understand being somewhat in the moment a little bit unfazed by that, but there's always some point at which the recognition hits you, and maybe we just didn't catch that moment on camera. However, given everything that's gone down, I saw this Facebook post. This was right around the time when my daughter lived in Rexburg at this time, and I was going up there to visit her for a couple of weeks. And I was supposed to stay with Summer on my way up to Idaho. And I stopped hearing back from her. Well, I found out later that she had traveled to New York. Well, she was in New York when the shooting happened. And so it wasn't until I got home from that trip, just a few days after I got home, I saw a post by Nicole, who is Adam's ex-wife. They were married at the time, saying that Charles had been killed. And I immediately texted her and said, I'm so sorry. What happened? Can I do anything for the family? What does Lori need? What's going on? And she just started to spew to me all of the circumstances that had happened, with Alex buying a gun a few days prior, staying over at her house. And in that moment, I knew that it was not self-defense, because I remembered what had happened with Joseph Ryan, where Alex had a pattern of violent behavior against Lori's exes. He had tased Joe Ryan in the parking lot during a custody exchange. And this incident happened during a custody exchange. It's like they knew where they were going to be. And, Alex did serve some time for that assault, so he had a record. And so I was really confused about, how did he get a gun? And why did the police not hold him for 24 hours, knowing that he had a history of violence against Lori's former spouses? Why didn't they hold him just for 24 hours and check his record? So I later learned that because Alex did his time, he had his rights restored. So he was allowed to legally own firearms, and he had many, apparently.
Because it wasn't a felony. It was
it was a violent crime. He did get his gun rights taken away for a time, but as part of him cooperating with that and serving his time, he got his gun rights later restored to him. So this assault on Joe Ryan,
important. That's important that we give people their gun rights back. Of all the things to give people. Yeah. That's the most important.
I mean,
mentally
I'm gonna
incompetent.
We're not going on that. We're not going down that rabbit hole on this
but
podcast.
yeah, that's
but
again a rabbit hole for another time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't remember the exact year that took place. I believe it was somewhere around the 2008-ish time frame, or something like that. And so I was confused as well, Renee, with your talking about the police and everything like that. Like, why didn't they hold him and all of that? It's also another one of the reasons why Charles's murder was the very last thing that was prosecuted in this case. So anyway, obviously I believed that Alex was guilty of murder. I believed that Lori was guilty of conspiring with him, but the family labeled Alex a hero at this time. They believed Lori's lies that Charles had been violent with Tylee And so they thought that Alex had really saved Tylee and Lori from this horrible, mean man. Adam was the only one who didn't believe that. And when he suggested that it was a murder, Janice kicked him out of the house, him and Zach, and said, "You're not part of this family anymore. Go away. We don't want to talk to you." And so, even though I knew what I knew, knew it, I didn't have any information that I could give police. I didn't have any way to even really participate because
It's all
the last
secondhand.
the last phone number that I had for Lori was like 3 phone numbers ago. The last address I had was like 3 addresses ago. I couldn't contact her on social media. I had no way to talk to her. I knew that my oldest daughter was still somewhat in contact with Colby, her oldest son, but not really communicating. And then Lori, um, the landlord where she was staying there in Chandler, the neighbors were very nervous about her and Alex being in the neighborhood. They didn't want a shooter living in the neighborhood. And so the landlord told them they had to be out by the end of August. So this incident happened on July 11th of 2019. And by August, they had to be out. And so Lori decided that she was going to take Tylee and JJ and move to Rexburg to be near Chad Daybell, because that's where he was living at the time. Now, I didn't know this at the time. I don't think the family knew this at the time. Not even Colby knew where she was going. And she cut off contact with everybody and then moved to one of her burner phones and stopped answering her regular number. So nobody in the family really knew where she went at that time, and where Alex went or where the kids were either. And so, I was hearing things secondhand from Nicole, who was in contact with Kay Woodcock. And Kay Woodcock is JJ's grandmother. And Kay was asking, where the kids were because she hadn't been able to FaceTime with JJ in a really long time. And so, I started hearing all of this information kind of second, third hand, but didn't have anything that I could do about it. I just was hearing, this is what we heard next. And then we heard that Lori called this person. We heard that she did this thing, but I had no way to really be involved in what was going on because Janice and that part of the family wasn't talking to anyone who believed that Alex was a murderer, And so, and even just by reposting Charles's memorial information and stuff, I was seen as other, like that side of the family.
Wow.
And so, I was hearing all this second, third hand. And so when Kay finally started asking, and saying like, well, I haven't talked to JJ, where are the kids? It was pretty late in October before I heard anything about Kay saying that she hadn't heard from JJ. And then I heard secondhand about the shooting attempt on Brandon Boudreau, who was Lori's former nephew. Melanie Boudreau's former husband. I knew that they had gotten divorced and it was super weird. And I had seen these posts from Melanie about, help me find my kids. I'm being estranged from my kids. And I was so confused about how any of that tied in together, except then I later found out that Melanie was in this little group of podcasters, doomsday prepper people that this group was forming. So, it wasn't until late October, into November before people started saying Lori is missing and we don't know where she is and we think she's with Chad. And I just wasn't really sure of all this that was going on. It really started coming to a head at the beginning of December. And I think that was the point at which I first contacted the FBI and I said, if you're looking for Lori and Chad, have you tried Hawaii? Because that was kind of the Cox family MO when things were going badly. We just take off to Hawaii. So I thought, maybe that's where they are. Maybe they have the kids with them there, talked real briefly with the FBI at that point. And then I heard, I guess I didn't hear until later that Chad's wife had died already. I didn't find out that she had died until Alex died. So Alex died on December 12th. And the only reason that I had heard that Tammy had died is because I learned they exhumed her body the day before on the 11th. Then I started to put the timeline together. Then I started to hear more and more, I was I was actively looking up articles now to find out what else was going on, because I realized there was stuff going on that I wasn't aware of, that the public started to know. The police had started to say some things. And that was when I put two and two together and went back to my experience with Alex when their oldest daughter Stacy died. And I called the FBI again and I said, I think my cousin Alex killed my cousin Stacy. And so I told them that whole story. They recommended that I call the police locally here because that's where it happened. And I did. But with the perpetrator deceased, the alleged perpetrator deceased, with the family probably not willing to talk about it, the body had been cremated, of course. And, back in 1998, when she died, this was before cell phones were really prevalent. The records would have been really hard to get. Who knows what evidence, any evidence that they would have had would have been destroyed by that time.
And that must have been like, I can't even imagine. I mean, this is the stuff that you see, on Dateline or whatever. If they still a show, I think it is. This is the stuff that you see as a Netflix documentary. I cannot imagine like what was going on. Were you just like, what the fuck? Like that's bananas to have something like that happen in your family. So what was were you just incredulous, or like, I'm just curious personally, on a personal note, like what you were what was going on for you?
It was a lot to absorb at the time. And Nicole and I were the only ones she was the only one who was in touch with me, telling me anything. Everything else I was getting secondhand. And so Nicole said right from day one, like, this is some 2020 Dateline bullshit that's going on here. This is definitely crazy behavior. And especially with now the kids missing and everything. And that was I guess the thing is that all of this was shocking and horrible, but not surprising. And that's what's weird about it, is that, Alex, shoot, let me see if I can do this without hanging up on this.
So just as a side note, you mentioned her very first husband, Lori's very first husband that she ran away with after high school. You would think he would have popped up somewhere, as the only living ex-husband.
Yeah, and Colby's dad too, William LaJoya, allegedly still alive, as far as we know. Yeah.
It's interesting that I guess I can understand they don't want that brought into their lives and their circle.
Right.
But and they might have been afraid. I mean, if they're running around killing people and everyone associated with these people is being shot at, tased, killed, I'd be like, I'm staying the hell away from that, because they might show up at your house and do a drive-by like they did with.
Well, and it's not over yet, because I've heard little things in the wind about Melanie she's not off the hook yet. There's still some things going on. So everyone thinks it's over. Lori's in jail. She's back in Arizona, or she's back in Idaho, and it's done now. And it's like, oh, this is going to come back next year or sometime.
And I've been covering now the Adelson case, the death of Dan Markell, which that's been going on for 11 years. And they've got 4 convictions right now, but they're going for a 5th conviction. They may even go for a 6th or a 7th. So my hope is that, when this first went to trial, when Lori's case went to trial, they said, they were reading the charging documents against Lori, Noreen Vallow, Chad Daybell, and other co-conspirators, both named and unnamed. Now, my, wide-eyed idealist little girl thought is, I want every single one of those co-conspirators to be held accountable. So if we have to go through 4 or 5 or 6 more trials, yes, let's do it. Because not only do the victims deserve justice against every single person who harmed them, but also the people need to be held accountable, other than something of just the court of public opinion, because what they did was wrong. And whether they were directly involved or not, they could have spoken up at any point and prevented further harm from coming to people.
And that was one of my questions for you, for your family. I've been writing things down as you were speaking, like and I can't remember all the names that you mentioned, but you talked about some specific people, sort of aiding and abetting what was happening, maybe not knowing that these two kids are going to end up dead, which is the most horrific part. I think these two super innocent, seemingly really sweet kids, knowing how it all transpired now, and that they protected these people because they thought they were being righteous and godly, knowing what happened. Have you talked with any of them? Are they like, oh shit, we fucked up? Are they like, do they still believe they're on the side of righteousness and those children
I
had
think they're
demons have to
scared to
die?
death. I think Melanie Gibb is scared to death. And because she was at the house when JJ, kind of disappeared, and her,
Yeah.
sleeping with her unmarried husband, which is, they're both active, prominent LDS people. I forget what positions of authority he held, but supposedly he was separated, but they were sleeping together, and they were there, that night, and they saw, and then they didn't see, but nobody said anything. They just got in their car and drove back to Idaho or wherever they were from.
Right.
And so I think she's nervous. I think they're all nervous that this isn't going to go away.
Yeah.
Good. And they should be nervous.
Yeah.
Yeah, they should be. And we can dig into a little bit, what co-conspirators were involved and, who had what roles and stuff. But as far as, Janice and Summer, I mentioned, were actively involved in giving Lori information that isolated Charles. So in my mind, they're complicit in that murder. However, I did read in the FOIA documents that after they interviewed Summer after the fact, they believed that she was an unwitting accomplice, is what they called her. They didn't think that she knew that Alex was planning to kill Charles,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
scare him or hurt him or whatever. However, I don't buy that, because there are other text messages that we saw from Summer where she referenced this hitman person that she knew named Edgar. And she also made a reference to saying, like, if it doesn't happen, I'll kill him myself. Now, all of that evidence has to be packaged up and brought together. And again, the prosecution, the attorneys are always going to go on likelihood of conviction. So if
Yeah.
they don't believe that it's enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt, they won't
Right.
bring charges.
Right.
I think it's most likely that Melanie Pulowski will get charged, but we can talk about that part of the case, if we have time later. But
Yeah.
basically, by the time a lot of this information was coming out, the children unfortunately had already been killed. And
Yeah.
of course, I didn't know it. Nobody knew it, because we were all still asking in December. Finally, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children finally in December put out a report with Charlie and JJ's picture, asking if people had seen the kids. And I will tell you, I lost hope that they were still alive when I heard that Lori had returned JJ's service dog, because I knew how important that was to JJ. And then there was some footage of a storage unit where you just saw bikes and scooters and toys and pictures of both of the kids, big blankets with their pictures on
Yeah.
them. And I thought, that's Lori trying to distance herself from the memory of those kids. I thought they definitely are not still alive. And I think that was probably in November or so when that came up.
And that was one of the weirdest things that stood out to me. And again, my touch point with this is just in hearing about it recently and then watching a documentary. So very bird's eye view from you guys. I know you guys know a lot more about it. Obviously you, Megan, and Renee, I know you know a lot as well. But in watching this, my jaw was on the floor when these kids were missing for months. And they're running around free. They're in, like, even if they were hidden somewhere at that point, like, why was an arrest not made? They are your children. You were last seen with them. You are charged with their care, and they're running off to Hawaii. Like, how in the fuck did that happen? That is totally bananas to me, and totally blew my mind in watching the documentary.
Yeah. So I'll go back and revisit some of those dates and what, what exactly happened. But so it was December, finally Alex dies. Then finally we get the report from the Missing Children Center that they put this up I reposted it. As soon as I reposted that, several family members blocked me on social media. And so I knew that there was still this contingent of people that were Team Lori, that didn't believe the kids were in any danger, that believed whatever she was saying about, I have to hide them to keep them safe and I can't tell you because then you'll be in danger. Meanwhile, what you were referencing earlier is this big list came out of all of Lori's family members that were labeled dark by Chad Daybell. You know, that was super concerning to all of us who are family members. You know, we were all scared for our lives. I think until Alex died. Finally, when he died, I breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief because he was the perpetrator of all of the violence. But even so, you know, of course, we were still really worried about the kids, didn't know for sure. And then finally, it wasn't until January, the middle of January, that she was arrested. And once she was arrested, I pulled the plug on all things Lori, and I stopped watching any news reports or anything because I just could not engage with it anymore. I was in this place where I was losing half of my family. None of my
Yeah.
immediate family members wanted to talk about the case. My dad would talk about it from time to time in little snippets here and there, but it was just so super disturbing to everybody. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And, you know, in my mind, I was like, okay, great. She's been arrested. We're eventually going to find out what happened. Again, didn't have any hope that the kids were still alive at that point. And just, I couldn't take the constant barrage of, you know, media reports, news reports, speculating on what had happened because we didn't have answers at this point. And I didn't want to speculate anymore. I wanted the
Right.
truth. And I knew
Right.
I wasn't going to get it from my family members. And so it wasn't until I think from January until like early June that I started getting curious again. Okay, she's been arrested. They're doing some investigation. Like, let's see what else they've found out that's real, factual stuff. And so I would wake up in the morning and I would check my phone. And the first thing I would do is I would just open a new Google tab and enter Lori Vallow today to hear what was like the most recent thing. And I would scroll through and I'd been like, read that, seen that, you know, and every once in a while something new would come out and I would ask Nicole about it. And just, it was just this palpable, heavy thing that just like sat on me for a really long time during that period. And then I just will never forget the day that I opened up my phone to look for new news and I saw a video with a news helicopter in the sky. And that was the day they found the kids' bodies. And once I knew that they'd been found, it was like I closed the book, I unplugged the laptop, I stopped looking at everything. And I just went to sort of grieve that in my own way. And the only thing I really knew at that point was that when they had moved to Rexburg, Tyler was killed shortly after that. I knew that JJ was killed a few weeks later. Then Tammy, there was an attempt on her life. There was an attempt on Brandon's life. Then Tammy was killed. Then they got married. Then they went to Hawaii. And that's where she was arrested. So I was aware vaguely of that sort of timeline, but I just completely unplugged from everything and went away from it. And it wasn't until she was getting ready to go on trial. So that was in June of 2020. And she went on trial, I believe, early April of 2023. And I actually had my faith crisis in January of 2023.
Oh.
And like just barely had deconstructed everything and had been watching Mormon stories, had been somewhat aware of Mormon stories during that time period. And then I saw them like doing a show on my family's case. And I was like, wait, that's wrong. That's not true. Wait, not that. It was this way. And I was like, oh no. So I started just watching that coverage, and then there started to be more and more news coverage. And I was sitting in a restaurant with my partner and his parents one night, and they had all these big screen TVs around. And I could vaguely hear, you know, talking head in the background on a news program. And he said, now the case of Lori Vallow Daybell. And I went, like, I was shocked to see her face on the screen. And my partner was like, here, switch places with me so you can't see the
Oh
screen.
my gosh.
And it was then that I became aware she was going on trial. So I started watching news reports again because I wanted to know the facts of the case. That's what I was interested in. And I started hearing all these news reports that were like, she was the pageant mom, she was a cheerleader, she was a beauty queen, she was the cupcake mom, she was the primary chorister, she was this perfect, wonderful, all-American woman. And then she met Chad Daybell and snap, she lost it and went off the deep end and killed her kids. And I was like, that doesn't sound right. Because, growing up with her, and especially when I lived with her, she was always manipulative. She always got her way. She would tell the family what to do and what to say and what to think. And that was a pattern she always had, especially like in her late teen years. And I knew that family stories had gotten whitewashed to, put her in the most favorable light and everything. And I was like, this can't stand. So I actually reached out to Justin Lum of Fox 10 Phoenix, who had been reporting on the case ever since Charles's death, and said, hey, I grew up with her. I have a little insight into how I think she got to where she is today. And that was the first interview I did. And then I was on Court TV a couple times, and then I went on. Lauren Matthias actually reached out to me. I had been on the Lori Vallow subreddit, sort of giving information about like, hey, here's some correct timeline stuff and whatever, just to help people understand the case. And one of the people there introduced me to Lauren Matthias, and she called and we talked probably for a couple of hours. And she said, you're just confirming a lot of the stuff that we've suspected but didn't know all along. So I went on her show and then on Mormon Stories, and really was able to tell a lot of, the family background dynamics that I thought led to this. But then it wasn't until, she went through her trial and everything. And then when right before Chad Daybell was going on trial in April of the following year, I had decided that fall to start my own podcast, totally unrelated to Lori, just related to healing from trauma, because that's what I first wanted to talk about. It's what I first started talking about. I had
And the
written my
universe hands
book.
you this.
Right. Well, yeah. And my book was published in July, I believe, of 2023. And so then I was going on a bunch of podcasts talking about my book and my healing experiences. And when people heard that I was Lori Vallow's cousin, of course, they're like, well, let's have you back and talk about this, because people were curious to know all the inside info there. So I decided to start my podcast because after doing all those book interviews, I was like, I want to do this on my own platform. But I didn't want it to be ExMormon, and I didn't specifically ExMormon, and I didn't want it to be specifically about Lori. I wanted to find a way to talk about those things at an intersection. So my podcast was supposed to launch in January, yada, yada, didn't ended up launching until April, which was right when Chad Daybell was going on trial. And it was funny because, I had probably 5 or 6 episodes that I released right when I started my podcast. They were all about healing, all about my book, Healing from Trauma, everything. And I would promote my podcast when I would go on these other shows. And so my episode would come out, it would get 300 or 400 views, sometimes 500 or 600 views. And then something would come out about the case or the trial that I wanted to comment on. And I would talk about that, and it would get thousands of views.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I was like, I don't want to talk about this. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I recognized I'd never been a true crime person at all. But I recognized that there was this little niche within true crime that were not consuming it for the schadenfreude of it. They were consuming it from the standpoint of, how do I not get dead? And how did we get here so I can prevent that happening in my family? And it was that second question that I wanted to answer for people. And so I started teaching people about narcissism, coercive control, manipulation, and how that led to getting Lori to where she was.
Well, and I think there's a thirst right now because of the political situation as well, that there's a mistrust for the news. And so you were a breath of fresh air when, like you were saying, the way that it was being reported, the way that she was being presented, and the way that the whole thing was being presented. And all of a sudden you're there, a voice of I was a witness. I mean, you're like a firsthand witness, and you're going, that's not how it happened. That's not what happened. That's not the truth. And so people are hungry for that. They're hungry for someone who was in the room when the shots were fired, and they want someone that was there to say, that doesn't, because we all live in families. We all have cuckoo heads and brilliant people and the whole bit. We all have
Right.
that. And so for these families to be portrayed as perfect and wonderful and loving, and oh, this accident just happened, and we all know that's not true. And so
Yeah.
you were the voice of someone going, that's not true. And people want to hear that. That's, I mean, it's just the humanness of not wanting to be gaslit anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. And I think it's interesting because you always hear that packaging for anybody when something like this happens. It's usually a man. It's unusual that a woman does this kind of thing usually.
Right.
It's usually a white man. But you always hear he was so nice. He kept to
Mhm.
himself, this and that. It's like the standard narrative.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting that they did that with her as well and just painted this like sort of perfect beauty pageant, perfect mother, because of course, because the story is so, I mean, that's how you write. That's a really good beat in writing is you have a great moment and then you go to a very dark moment. That's horror.
Right.
So that's the story that is always sort of put out in the media. So it is great to hear from someone who was there and can go, no, that's not how she was. She was actually a narcissist, and some of us could have
Yeah.
seen this coming, which is super fascinating and a departure from the standard narrative, I think.
Yeah.
It's the funeral eulogy that's now getting more and more popular, where people are saying, the daughter of the mother is giving the eulogy, and she's like, she was wicked, she was mean and wicked, and and that's
Yeah.
the eulogy that people want to hear. They're like, I don't think he was that nice. But
Right.
and that's what the news does. They do these funeral eulogies where the neighbors are like, he was the nicest guy. I would have
Right.
never known he had 4 bodies in his basement,
Right.
So,
Right.
Um,
And it's because we see people from the outside, and I think it's
yeah,
particularly prominent in the LDS church where we're so shocked when somebody does something untoward because we see them at church on Sunday in their Sunday best. We see that they've got a Mormon card, and we give them a pass because
yeah,
in my former life, as a true believing, very naive Mormon person, it never crossed my mind that somebody would lie in their temple recommend interview.
yeah,
Never crossed my mind. So I
yeah,
always thought temple recommend equals good person, somebody you can trust no matter what.
right.
And I do think that there is this disconnect in Mormonism of what is portrayed at church on Sunday and what's really happening behind the scenes. And
Yeah,
I think that it's not unique to Mormonism. However, I do think that there's a level of naivete among members about this contingent of people who aren't the good Mormons. There's like 90% of the people in the church who are trying to live a really good life and are just being good Christians, good neighbors, good citizens. And then there's this other 10% that use that as a mask to hide behind who they really are.
yeah,
and
and floodlets bring that out, with all of their sexual abuse, and the recent case of the man who got letters written about how wonderful he was, and his case was
Right.
basically dismissed. I think he got 180 days or something like that, because people verified that he was a good guy. He took out my garbage when I was on vacation. He shoveled my driveway. He was the nicest guy. There's no way
Yeah.
he could have done that. And the court system, which is also, a little bit filled with, people that are of the same faith. And they were like, well,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to believe them. They never believe the victims. So
yeah,
Yeah.
and
just like
the
Charles.
yeah.
Right.
And the perspective that I always bring to this podcast is obviously as an outsider. So I am always looking in, and Mormonism has been this new thing that I've experienced in the last 4 years since moving to Utah. And that you guys both just hit the nail on the head. The Kate and I have talked a lot about the sheen, which is really unnerving for me. This sort of like, even when we're sad, we act like we're happy. And this like
Right.
everything has to be shiny and perfect. And even where I worked in Utah Valley, the organization had huge issues and massive, some pretty significant financial troubles, and did this beautiful landscaping. It looked gorgeous rising in, and everyone on the inside was like, we don't have enough money for X, Y, or Z. Like, how is this happening? So yeah, it just seems to be part and parcel of the culture to like put a gloss on it, and that'll be fine, even if it's rotten underneath or murderous underneath, which is kind of wild to me.
Yeah. So where are you at, Megan, as far as, now that Lori is back in Arizona and the trial is over, she's got 5 life sentences, I think it is, that she's going to be serving, which is whatever. Have you completely like put this away, or are you keeping up with, are you aware of anything that's going on in her new, her and Chad rekindled, or do they get what's the term when you get the person
Conjugal visit.
Yes, do they get conjugal visits?
Well, let me just say it's never going to completely go away. This is part of my life and my history now that, I've made it a big deal in my life because it was so important to me to tell the truth about what was happening.
Yeah.
And I said often that I learned more about my real family from reading FOIA documents and hearing court testimony than I did from the people in my own family.
That's excellent.
I was on this journey of like discovering the truth about my family through going and attending the trials and the cases, and learning things about my family stories that were not true, that never could have been true, and so I was gaslit my entire life. So I made this a big deal because I was tired of being lied to by the people who are supposed to be my family members, because I want to know. Also, a trauma response, I understand. I want to know in my life who's safe and who's not safe. And the only way for me to know that is to hear the truth about family members and their involvement. And so I've made a lot of determinations about that makes me feel really settled and safe. All of that being said, I really don't care to know when Lori, when she got transferred back to Idaho. I put it on my watch later list and I watched it a couple weeks later and I was like, all right, whatever. What is interesting to me, though, is that her 2 cases in Arizona, she represented herself because of course she did. And so she's going to continue to file appeals and motions until they will make her stop. And every time she files something, we learn something new about the real truth of what happened, because she can't help herself. I think psychologically, deep down, she wants the real truth to come out. We've all heard her version in the several interviews that she did with Dateline, with Keith Morrison and with Brianna Whitney of Arizona Family. And every time she did one of those interviews, people were infuriated. Why are you giving her a platform? But it's so important because every time we would get another little nugget of information that was the real truth that we hadn't heard before. So I'm going to continue to follow when she files something that is in her own words. Her appeal in Idaho, I'm not super interested in because she has an appeals attorney for that. And, while some of her ideas might get in there, it's going to be behind a veneer of lawyer speak, et cetera. So as much as I don't really care about that, but if there's something interesting or some kind of movement in the case, of course I'm going to cover that, because I want to find out if she, if anything happens with that appeal, if they decide to revisit something, I want to know why. But other than that, a lot of people on my channel, and it's funny to watch, like I would get a ton of subscribers during Lori's trial, and then a bunch, hundreds would drop off while there was no trial going on. Same thing with Chad's trial. Same thing after Arizona. My numbers have been really stagnant since the sentencing, which is funny because I've been gaining a lot of subscribers, but also losing, right? So it kind of has stayed at the same level. And it's interesting to me, I call it curating my audience, because the people who were just here for the family tea and the Lori backstory are going away, and that's perfectly fine. The people who are staying are the ones who care about healing. I'm applying the template of what Lori did to other true crime cases like the Adelson case, which is another enmeshed family situation. So that's what's interesting to me, is to continue to study human behavior. And I have a course out. I did a whole e-course about how to recognize and defend against manipulation and control. I'm getting ready to start another e-course about effective communication in relationships. So I'm always passionate about teaching people how to have healthier relationships and ultimately healthier religions and healthier lives. So I'm never going to stop talking about that. And Lori's name is going to come up from time to time as this
Yeah.
example of an experience that I've been through where it went off the deep end, because not only did you have this manipulative, controlling person, you had a lot of people enabling her. And then
Yes.
you got together with Chad Daybell, who was another manipulative, controlling person. And then, in my opinion, the most asked question I always get is like, who was manipulating who? Who was driving the bus? I saw evidence of them manipulating each other.
Yeah.
Chad would manipulate her, then she would do it back to him, and they would sort of guide each other down this path to what they ultimately wanted, which was to be alone, child free, believing that they were both exalted beings with this special mission, and that God is going to, provide for them and has sanctioned everything that they've done.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like soulmates from hell.
Right.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, it sounds like throughout Lori's life, it was you were aware that she had some sort of mental health issues, whether it was narcissism or whatever. I'm curious what you think about the role specifically of Mormonism and someone like Chad, if she had been brought up, say, Baha'i or atheist, or if there had been, do you think that she would have found her way to? I mean, it sounds like she's had delusions of grandeur and all the things that she believes that she's enlightened and can kill these people and do
Hmm.
so righteously. I'm curious if you think what you think the role of her specific Mormon religion is, and if she would
Mm.
have had a different path, or if this mental illness was sort of going to develop as it was, either which way.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it's one that a lot of people ask too, is like, how much did Mormonism contribute to everything that happened? And, first I will say, I didn't know anything about mental illness until I, for the first time, went to a non-Mormon therapist. And we talked about this in the last episode of how important that was for me to get a non-Mormon perspective on what I was going through. And as I started to learn these different types of abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, financial abuse. And as I started to sort of learn the vocabulary for how to talk about these people in my life, I would learn about these things and I would go, oh, who does that sound like? And I would start to make these connections, like, oh, this interaction, that interaction. And that's how I started to learn and understand what kind of a person Lori really was. So I was like, oh, so that time when she made up a bunch of crap about me that wasn't true and then told her mom about it, and her mom showed up at the apartment to kick me out because Lori said I was a bad influence, that was just Lori manipulating the situation. Like, I never understood it. I was so confused. Why would you do that? That was Lori getting me out because she didn't want me as competition. And so I was like, okay, now I understand how to frame that. So I didn't know anything about mental illness when I was interacting with her. But in learning about it later, then I had a framework for putting all these experiences into, including my interactions with Alex and Janice and Barry. So what I did too in this effort to understand Lori was I went back into the family story and remembered a lot of things that were contributors along with the religion. And I have to say the main one is Janice Cox, her mom, telling Lori that she was the reincarnation of her sister who had died in infancy, and telling her that narrative from very, very early on. And that's not a mainstream Mormon belief, but it's one of those things where Mormons are encouraged to seek after your own light and knowledge. Go to the temple, get your own revelation for your life circumstances. And so there are some Mormons who will say, well, if we believe this and this is in the doctrine, then maybe it means 2 plus 2 equals 17. That makes sense in my mind. And I think that's what Janice did, is she believed that, if infants, like if we're all up in heaven waiting to come down and get a body in this life, like they teach us in Saturday's Warriors and some of those other things, that this little spirit was waiting to come down to earth and then got a body, but then died within 6 weeks. Well, Janice put together that, well, that baby, must have been so special, because we are taught that babies who die in infancy immediately go to the highest level of Mormon heaven. And so they must have been really righteous and spiritual in the life before this one. And so that's Janice putting that idea together with the idea that, well, the next baby that I have, maybe it'll be that spirit coming back again. So they get a full experience, but they were so righteous. They're already guaranteed to be in the celestial kingdom. So it must be a really special person with a really special mission. And that's what Lori was taught about herself. So Janice had several children. Stacy was the oldest, then Alex, then Adam. Then she had a baby who they named Laura Lee, and they nicknamed her Lolly. And she had a congenital heart defect, and she died after being alive for only 6 weeks. And then 2 years later, almost to the day, Lori was born. And I always thought it was so weird that you have a baby die, and the baby's name is Laura Lee, and then you name your next child Lori. That just always seemed so weird to me. I never really understood that, but Janice explained it. Lori was Laura Lee's spirit coming back to Janice in that body. So that's a core Mormon belief, or at least, an offshoot of a core Mormon belief that I think contributed to Lori's state of mind. And we heard in all of the trials that she created a new email address around the time that she met Chad, and it was Lolly Time. And then another one that was Lolly Time Forever. So I think that was Lori stepping into her role as this special spirit that had come back with a special mission. So that was a big part of it. But the core Mormon doctrine of belief in prior probations, the little couplet that goes, as man now is, God once was. And as God now is, man may become, which in my mind, another 2 + 2 = 17 thing is that, well, if God was once like this, then that means he had a mortal experience where he came to earth and followed all the commandments and proved to his God that he was righteous enough to become a God when his life was over.
Right.
And so that's where I think Lori and Chad got some of this multiple probations thing, where I knew you in a past life, we were married in a past life, and also the Adam God theory that went around in the early church where, in the temple, we watch a video where Adam participates in the creation of the world. And so this idea that, well, in the previous life, he was a really righteous dude. So then he helped create the world that he then came to have a mortal experience. And now he's probably a god of his own planet. So that's where Chad gets saying that he was the Holy Ghost in a past life, for God's sake. And the thing that I always joke about is like, they were never like a scullery maid in a past life. They were never a street sweeper. They were always
know.
Cleopatra.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not that I was married to, I don't know, I wasn't married to a garbage man in a past life. It was always like a prophet or a patriarch or something. So my take on this has always been that without Joseph Smith founding the church the way that he did, without the Book of Mormon, without personal revelation, without the belief in a pre-existence and a future where there's gods, you don't get Lori and Chad. Because I started to see, having left the church right before Chad's trial started, and one of the main things that caused me to just want to burn the whole thing to the ground, which warrior princess part of myself, I have to say thank you for being so passionate about this. Now, please step away for a moment so that we don't burn everything. But that warrior princess part of me, listening to a talk by Sandra Tanner, where she used the word sexual predator to describe Joseph Smith. And I was like, because having come from that abusive background, I was like, 100%. That's exactly what he did. He would isolate a potential victim away from her family. He would step in to be this benevolent caretaker, essentially grooming the child, and then say, guess what? God told me we're going to be together. And you have 24 hours to answer. And also, by the way, if you say no, God's going to destroy me. So I hope you don't say no.
So
And
Yeah.
manipulative.
horribly
Well,
manipulative.
that's what I was going to
So,
say with that if you look at Mormonism, and I could be wrong. I've not studied. This is strictly from just looking and watching different videos. And there's because of Christian nationalism right now, there's a lot of stuff out there about the evangelical world, and I see crazies. And I see, especially from the docuseries, The Religion Business that came out, there's definitely fraud and there's
right,
definitely using people's money for personal use and but the amount of violence in the Mormon church that is also prescribed by God, I feel
right.
is unique. I feel like
Yes,
Ruby and Jody and Lori and the Lafferty brothers and Ted Bundy and all of these people are unique because it's not just I heard a voice from God. It's there's something deeper that is truly has to be funneled back into Mormonism. And
right,
and like I said, I could be wrong. I'm not a professional on all of the crimes that have been done. I don't know what religion Jack the Ripper was, but there just seems to be a difference between the crazy lady that drowned her children who heard voices, but she didn't
right,
have a religious book behind her showing her that that was fine, that she could do
right.
that. But you know what? The Muslims have that. They have that same violence. And so you
Hmm.
see the same violent behavior or the treating of women because they also have a book and prophets that give them permission to do that. And that's why Mormonism
Right,
and Islam, I feel, are two very, very closely knit religions, and they're both violent.
right, right.
And
And
it sounds, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say thank you for saying that, Renee, because, while yes, there are the religious aspects of it, this is the other thing that I've started to uncover and dig more into is the violence that was baked into Mormonism.
Right.
And we don't get taught about that enough as members, as faithful believing members, because, up until the time that I even left the church, I still believed that Joseph Smith was constantly being carted off to prison on trumped up charges that weren't real.
Yes,
And we
yes.
don't get told the fact that some of his very first incarcerations and trials in front of court were over his own violence, him beating people into within an inch of their lives.
Yeah.
So violence is baked into Mormonism. It's baked into Mormon scripture. I did a whole video about how violent the Book of Mormon is. I think it was something like 19 instances of violence in the Book of Mormon. And those were just the worst ones, not even, the more benign ones.
Right.
Um, and then Brigham Young perpetuated the violence in Mormonism. Joseph Smith allowed the formation of the Danites, which was basically a security enforcer squad that did go around killing people for not obeying the commandments. And blood atonement is baked into Mormonism, where the belief was literally that some sins, the only way you can atone for them is by literally spilling your blood. It's baked into the temple covenants, where before 1990, people would make the hand gestures of slitting their own throat and disemboweling themselves if they ever revealed the secrets of the temple or if they ever broke their covenants with God. So violence is baked into Mormonism. We cannot deny that. And it's another one of those scenarios where without the be like Nephi narrative, I don't think we would have ever gotten to this place. I also want to point out, the Be Like Nephi narrative was talked about among the co-conspirators prior to the killing of Charles Vallow, which was the first murder in this series. Well, arguably, we can talk about other alleged things, but
Yeah.
it was the first one considered part of this case. Um, and that was the idea that Lori texted Alex saying, I am going to be like Nephi, I'm told, and so will you. And so throughout the trial in Arizona, the first trial for Charles Vallow, Mormon scripture quoted from the stand, witnesses getting up and giving testimony as to what they thought about the Be Like Nephi story. There is
Right.
no more Mormon crime than this. And yet, mainstream Mormons will continue to say, this has nothing to do with us. This has
Yeah.
nothing to do with our church. It's a couple of crazies who took it off into the deep end. Did they? Because Britt Hartley did this incredibly wonderful video just a little while back where she said her theory is not that Lori went off the deep end. It's that she believed the fundamentalism of Mormonism too hard. She was too fundamental. She was so fundamental. And that's what caused these crimes to be okay in her mind. And I
Right.
totally agree.
It
Right.
sounds like somewhat of an inevitability. If you have a group of people, a religion that is millions of people across the world, there are going to be some portion of them who have some sort of mental illness that lets them kind of take something to the extreme, whether that is its doctrine. Because if you live like the Book of Mormon, and you're following it to the letter, the things that she did are okay because she's been told by God, she's been commanded by it. Joseph did a lot of horrendous things because he was commanded by God. But then on
Right.
top of that, the idea that you are very special and you're able to sort of determine these certain things, like whether someone is a 4D, 4 dark into hell, or
Right.
possessed by demons, or a 4L. And isn't it funny? It just happens to correspond with the people that you want to be hanging out with and
Right.
being friends with, but that you are able to somehow divine this because of your unique specialness. Sort of,
Right.
it just seems like a just like the perfect storm of mental health, and then the support of that coming from this really harmful doctrine, which is kind of
Right.
fascinating.
Well, and what's interesting is I live very close to Porter Rockwell's trail. And I followed it one day to the statue of Porter Rockwell. And I'm like, isn't he the guy that killed people for Brigham Young and Joseph Smith?
Hmm.
And it's like, but there you've got the history that's been rewritten. There's actually a Porter Rockwell Scout merit badge that you can earn. That's how, idealized he's been made. And he was a freaking drunk murderer.
Yeah.
But that's how far the church will go to whitewash their history, where people name roads and trails and buildings after Porter Rockwell,
Right.
So I
Right,
mean,
because it's
that's
been so whitewashed.
yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
I wanna point out too along the way, as far as Chad's part, he was just a terrible author until he met Julie Rowe. And
yeah,
then when he met Julie Rowe and he started publishing her books, she was claiming to have had near-death experiences, which she said gave her special insight into the spirit world. Well,
right,
then all of a sudden, Chad's terrible books became not just terrible books, but his own near death experiences. Oh, these were real. These were visions that I had. They weren't just terrible books. And so that's when Chad made a transformation from just ordinary awful author and publisher to spiritual guru, because he'd had these near death experiences, which he said ripped the veil for him so that he could see, light. And he had these powers of light and dark. And he had a little owl pendulum, which, by the way, was a necklace that he found while he was cleaning the chapel one day, that he would use this pendulum to, determine whether people were light and dark. And oh, by the way, nobody in Chad's family was dark. It was just Lori's family that had dark
yeah,
Surprise,
people.
surprise.
yeah. None of his
Amazing how
kids
that
were
works.
were in danger.
Right.
Well,
And so that's why I started seeing these parallels between Joseph Smith and Chad Daybell, where they both did this thing, which I don't know if was accidental or conscious, but it was brilliant either way, because it led to Joseph Smith, in my opinion, forming the most successful cult in history. But what they would do is they would gather a little group of followers around them who were loyal, who believed that they had something special to offer, and they would assign each one of them a really special, important part of this group, whether it was the church of Joseph Smith or whether it was the Church of the Firstborn, which Chad said he was representing. He would tell them all they had special powers. He would give them a special assignment and say, you're going to be instrumental in bringing forth the gathering of the 144,000. And of course, you want to believe that you're special and that you have a part in this special club.
right.
And then Joseph started systematically removing anyone who disagreed with him. Well, Chad and Lori did the exact same thing. We saw some of them come to the stand, during these last two trials. So the parallels are like, Joseph Smith gave us a template to do this thing. And somebody said, if you want to be rich, start a company. If you want to be really rich, start a religion.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so I think that's the direction that all of this was headed, was just for Lori and Chad to get whatever they wanted and to have power and control over people and to do whatever they wanted and try to justify it using
Yeah.
religion.
Megan, thank you so much for for all of this story is mind-blowing. I mean, no one has a story like that. So thank you. I know you've shared it a million times. Thank you for sharing maybe a little bit of a fresh perspective, for
Sure.
yourself and
Yeah.
definitely for us. It was really fascinating to hear an inside perspective on such a compelling story. And thank you again for all your work in what you're doing with healing and working with people and using your experiences that can be were difficult and using that to lift other people up. I love that.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much. And Renee, thank you for co-hosting again. I so love just chatting with you, hearing from you. You're just
Thank you.
you're great, and I love
Well,
having you
it
back.
was totally my pleasure, and Megan, the rose that I took from this was the one statement that you made, that if nothing else, this opened your eyes to your complete family dynamics, that you were able to have the veil removed, and you were able to see everybody and the truth, and to me, that was
Yeah.
like, that's what we all need,
Yeah,
Yeah.
before someone gets murdered. We need to start
Right.
recognizing
yeah,
maybe the stories that are being told.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah.
It's always so lovely to be with you ladies. Love you both.
Yep.
Love you. Thank you so much. And with that, we will say cheers
Cheers to
Cheers to
to
deconstructing
deconstructing Mormonism.
deconstructing
Mormonism. Bye-bye.
Mormonism.